The audience, thank you for taking part to the last question. And it's time to move on to our last speaker. The next speaker needs no introduction. He is an Taoiseach of Ireland and a star centre-right politician. Please welcome an Taoiseach Leo Varadkar.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the EPP Congress in Helsinki. First time I've attended one of these for a very long time. Had the pleasure to attend a few of these in the past when I was on the board of the youth of the European People's Party, and it's a singular pleasure to come back here as my party leader and as Prime Minister of my country. As you can see, I was asked to speak about integration the centre-right way, so this is going to be much less interesting than the previous talks which you've heard, but perhaps as an opportunity for us to pull together some of the ideas that you've heard from the other speakers already, and to reflect on what we can do as a party, as the EPP, to advance integration across our continent, but to do it in a way that reflects our values, our Christian democratic and centre-right values. So I should start with the first slide, which is really an attempt to introduce myself, if it's there. Next one, I think, I'm afraid. Okay, so those are various pictures of me. I really hate the one on the left. I don't know quite what I was doing when that photograph was taken, but I can't understand how I managed to put that photograph in people's letterboxes and into their houses, but I did nonetheless. But that's the first time I ran for election. Up the top there was when I became a leader of my party, and below that was when I was elected as Taoiseach in our parliament. And many of you will know that I'm a relatively young politician, 39 when I was elected as Taoiseach, became the youngest Taoiseach in Prime Minister of my country's history. My background is that I'm biracial. My father is from India originally. My mother is Irish. They met, fell in love and married in England before coming back to Ireland before I was born. And I'm also an openly gay man. But actually, when I became leader of my party and when I became leader of my country, none of that really was a big deal. It was commented on, but wasn't an enormous issue. It was, in fact, probably something of greater comment in the international press than it was in our own media and our own news. And in many ways, what that said to me was that I have in no way changed my country. My country changed dramatically in the past 10 or 20 years. And the fact that my country has become more modern and become more integrated and become more open and become more diverse enabled somebody like me to become leader of my party, to become Prime Minister of my country, which perhaps would have been impossible or even unthinkable 20 or 30 years ago. So the next pictures are just some images of Ireland, our country, Ireland, which will be the next slides here. You can see our flag, and you can see some scenes from some of the major referendums and constitutional changes that we had in recent years. And traditionally, Ireland, as you know, was a very insular country, very socially conservative, very much dominated by Catholic ideas in the Catholic Church. When we became independent, in some ways, we exchanged British imperialism for Catholic dogma, and took a long time before we found our own civic space, which we have in recent years. And it is a country that has been transformed, I think, in the past 20 years. At the moment in Ireland, 1 in 7 people, about 16% of people living in Ireland, was not born in Ireland, are from all over Europe and all over the world. And we don't have any far-right or anti-immigration party. So, of course, there's racism that exists everywhere, but not to the extent that it does in many other European countries. And also, I believe that the fact that so many people have come in from other countries, that so many Irish people went abroad, lived abroad, and came back with new ideas, and the fact that we're part of a European Union has helped transform us, and transform us much for the better. And if you go back not too long ago to the Ireland of the 1990s, when I was in school, not that long ago, in college in fact, it was illegal in Ireland to be gay. We didn't decriminalise homosexuality until 1993. In 1995 or 1996, by a whisker, by 10,000 votes, we voted to allow people in Ireland to become divorced. It was not possible to get divorced in Ireland up until the late 1990s. And we've talked about Islam and Islamic law. Under Irish state law, it was not possible for somebody to get divorced up until 1996. We also had huge debates over issues such as contraception. I remember in my lifetime it was only possible for somebody to get contraception if they got a letter from their doctor, a prescription from their doctor saying that this was okay. And we had huge debates about whether it should be possible to buy a condom, for example, without going into a pharmacy, because the concern in Ireland was that if we allowed contraception to be available freely, that it would give rise to promiscuity and people would have lots of sex and terrible things like that might happen in our country. And indeed, many things happened in our country, but they didn't turn out to be all that terrible. But as I say, we have been a country in recent years that really has been transformed. One of the images there is from our marriage equality referendum, when we decided as a country to have a referendum to put in our constitution provision for marriage equality, saying that a man could marry a man, a woman could marry a woman, and that marriage was based on love and not on anything else. We followed that up with legislation on transgender people, which is among the most progressive in the world. Doesn't require it to be medicalized. You don't need to go to a doctor. You don't need a psychological assessment. People can decide for themselves how they wish to identify in terms of their gender. And most recently, as you'll know, this year we had a referendum to liberalize our abortion laws up until even, in fact, it's now the case at the present because we haven't got the legislation through the Parliament yet, although some of that's happening this week. An abortion could only be carried out in Ireland if a woman might die as a result of the pregnancy. There were no other grounds on which it was permitted, even if she was 14 or 15 years old, even in cases of rape, even in cases where a woman's health might be severely damaged by the pregnancy. It was illegal in Ireland. And we took the decision to put to the people not a halfway house, but a proposition whereby we would give women the right to choose to end their pregnancies if they wish to do so. It was a big risk. We weren't very sure if we'd win the vote. We were terrified that if we didn't win the vote, that we would be set back for 20 or 30 years. And as it happened, the Irish people voted by 2 to 1 to change our laws and to give women the right to choose. And just last weekend, we made a further change, which was to take any reference to blasphemy out of our constitution, because that was put in what was a very Catholic-inspired constitution in the 1930s, that blasphemy should be a crime. And even though nobody was ever prosecuted for blasphemy, it was actually used by other countries around the world. Some Muslim countries, for example, who do prosecute people for blasphemy, we saw examples of that in Pakistan quite recently, would point to Ireland and would say, here's a European country, here's a modern country, and they enshrine the concept of blasphemy being a crime in their constitution. And we took that out, and we thought that was a very important symbol to the world. We've also, in recent years in particular, tried to become leaders around gender equality, bringing in legislation to make sure that if any political party wants to receive state funding, it has to make sure that at least 30% of its election candidates are female, and that will go up to 40% in the next decade. We've legislation as well coming through around gender pay, making sure that companies explain why they don't pay men at the same rate as women and vice versa. We've made a particular effort around appointing more and more women to state boards. So over 40% of women, over 40% of people now serving on government boards or state boards are female, and more than half of appointments made last year were female. So we've a long way to go, and I think it would be saying too much to suggest that Ireland could be a model for integration in Europe. But I do think our experience does potentially give Europe some examples as to how we can advance ideas of integration. And the Europe that I think we should seek to build in Europe, and I have this written out here in the next slide, is a vision that I think we could make part of our EPP vision, which is that we should try to build a Europe in which nobody feels left out. And I think that really involves adopting 3 sets of policies. The first, I think we particularly as the centre-right political party should try to respect that people are individuals and acknowledge that everyone is an individual. We see the far right in particular who try to categorize people according to race, according to religion, according to gender, according to sexual orientation. We see this with populists in Europe. We see it with Trump and others in America who try to say that you are a particular type of person and you're one of us and they are the other. And they do that around gender, race, sexual orientation, religion, lots of other things. And actually, the left do something similar as well, but they do it on socioeconomic grounds. They try to break down society and divide people on class grounds. And they say that I'm working class, that person is middle class, that person is prosperous or posh. They're the other. They look different, they sound different. They're not like us, so therefore their views and their experience must be legitimate. So in many ways, the left does that too. They do exactly the same as what populists and the far right do in terms of dividing people into different categories and saying that that person is different and other and therefore doesn't deserve to be listened to. Their views don't count. They shouldn't be respected. Their experiences don't matter. And what we should do as a centre-right party is accept that people are actually individuals and should be treated as individuals. Everyone is formed by their experience, by their background, by their parents, by their community, by all of those things that divide us. But actually we're all individuals. And we all know cases, so many examples, of two brothers who might grow up in the same house, have had the same opportunities, the same background, the same religion, the same parents, and turn out very differently because there are things like free will. There are personal choices that people make, and there is personal responsibility. And we should be the ones who speak up for that. Every society has rights and entitlements, and citizens in societies must have rights and entitlements, but coming with them are responsibilities and duties. Duties to obey the law, responsibility to work, to better yourself, to study, and to take opportunities where they arise. And I think that's a position that we can take at the foundation of the idea of integration. The second has been touched on, I think, a lot by the previous speakers, is to make sure that people have access to economic opportunity and to educational opportunity. The opportunity to work, to get a job, the opportunity to better yourself through education. And I think the message that we should always give to people in society is that if they work hard, if they study hard, that they can do well in any society. And that's why it's important that we ensure that people have equal access to the labour market and that people have equal and good access to education as well, all the way through, starting from childcare and preschool, all the way through to higher level. And the third thing, and I think we should become advocates for this as well, is to recognise that governments and EPP governments need to bring into place policies that will accelerate change. And I, in the past, would have been sceptical of positive discrimination, sceptical of things like quotas, and I'm more and more convinced, as I've been in positions of power and responsibility in government, that you actually do require those accelerators. It's roughly 100 years since women were allowed to vote in Europe. Happened at different times in different countries, but roughly 100 years. Yet 100 years later, we still have very few female prime ministers, very few female presidents, very few parliaments, which are 50-50. And that's why I think we need to make sure that we put in place measures, even if it's only for a period of time, that accelerate the advancement of women throughout politics. And the same applies in other areas. Policies and quotas that encourage more people with disabilities to take up work, something that we need to do across Europe as well. Policies and priorities that do this in other areas as well, particularly around educational disadvantage, making sure that more people from non-traditional backgrounds have access to education. And even if those things only have to be there on a temporary basis, they do need to be there because government's role cannot be just to wait for things to change over time, because they won't. It must be to put in place policies that accelerate social change and bring about integration. And through those three things, doing what I think we can do, which is to build a Europe in which nobody feels left behind. So thank you.
Dear and Taoiseach, thank you so much for your talk. The audience, now is your golden opportunity to ask questions. Who would like to go first? Yeah, gentleman over there.
Taoiseach, thank you very much. I'd like to hear a little more from you on your third point, and if you could say a little more on the degree of nudge, degree of compulsion that you have in mind to promote the sort of change you're talking about. I myself would be in favor, for example, of a degree of compulsion in learning the language of the country to which the newcomer has come. Because on the one hand, one doesn't want excessive compulsion, but it is a fact, certainly in the United Kingdom and certainly in Sweden, in both cases I have first-hand knowledge, of there being 3 generations without a truly fluent command of the language. It's natural that people should want to form national groups to meet and to socialize, but I think the point has been reached at which any state funding or encouragement of such organizations should be declined in the interests of a greater integration with the population as a whole.
Yeah, well, I think you make a very valid point. If people don't speak the native language of the country, and if they don't learn that language, it's really impossible for them to integrate fully. Very hard to get jobs in the labour market, very hard to access education fully. Those of us who are in English-speaking countries, it's probably a little bit easier. English has become so much the language of the world that that's less of a problem than it might be perhaps in other countries. One thing we've done in Ireland, which I think has worked very well, is we have a whole citizenship ceremony. So if you became a citizen, it used to just be a administrative process. You'd fill in your forms. It would all suddenly come back at some point and you might get to become a citizen. And we've brought in a whole set of citizenship ceremonies. I don't know how many countries do them. I know it's very much done in the United States. And people are actually sworn in by a judge as citizens of their new country. And they're really wonderful occasions. We've naturalized, I think, 120,000 people in the past 5 years, which is a lot actually for a country of 5 million. We've never gone as far as making it a requirement for people to learn the language, and I'm not sure I would go as far as that, but I think nudge is the term that you used, and I think that would be appropriate, and certainly to provide language classes to refugees and migrants so that they can have the opportunity to integrate.
I would like to present the next question. You went through all the changes Ireland has gone through in the last 20 to 30 years. It seems that the last 10 years, change has just been accelerating in speed.
But was it Vladimir Lenin who said sometimes nothing happens and then it all happens all of a sudden?
Exactly. So what was
or something like that?
What made this happen in Ireland?
I don't know for sure. I think history will write that in a few decades' time. I definitely do think our membership of the European Union has been a big part of it. And some of the changes that happened were actually forced by European law and European jurisprudence. And we talk a lot about the rule of law at the moment and the European courts. It was actually the European Court of Justice, or I think it was maybe the European Court of Human Rights, that forced us to decriminalise homosexuality. So I do think that some of it was European driven. But it was much more than that. I think actually a lot of it was down to people's personal experience, the fact that people lived abroad and came back, the fact that we had migration into the country. And I do think as well the demise of the power of the Catholic Church in Ireland, which held sway for so long, when there were scandals related to the church, particularly around child sex abuse. People who would always in the past have taken their lead from the bishops or from religious dogma were really challenged and had to think afresh. But there are just a few things. But one thing I do remark on in Ireland is that whereas we used to be an outlier in the past in the West in being a very conservative country, I think increasingly we're becoming an outlier in being a very socially liberal country, because I see so much in other parts of the world, things going in the other direction. In the United States, in a lot of Central and Eastern Europe, governments that now wish to restrict the freedoms of women and ban same-sex marriage from their constitutions, and I just hope that we're not going through a cycle where we end up in that place as well at a certain point.
Let's take one last question from here.
Tishak, thank you very much for a very inspiring presentation. We are here at the EU Election Congress electing a Spitzenkandidat. How do you see the future of the EU coming up with the elections next year? What is your wish or hope, also in terms of integration, tolerance? What can the EU do to enable it in all member states?
Yeah, that requires a very long answer, so I'll try and keep it short. I do think one of the things I hope we will do is to continue to give the European perspective to countries that haven't yet joined the European Union. There are a lot of parties here, from parties in the Balkans, from countries in the Balkans, from countries that are not yet in the European Union. And notwithstanding the difficulties that we've had, I think that enlargement into Central and Eastern Europe has been an enormous success. has meant that by and large democracy has been embedded in those countries, that we have free markets, and that we have the rule of law, even though if that is being threatened in one or two countries. And I think if we want countries in the Balkans and other parts of Europe to continue on the European track, we must make sure that further enlargements can happen and that we don't string those countries along, that we allow them to join the European Union as soon as they can. The second thing I think, which is going to be important as well, is for us more and more to remind people why the European Union happened and how it came about. I think it's only now that the UK, for example, is leaving the European Union that a lot of people in the UK are actually realizing what the benefits of being in the European Union were. Because for decades their politicians told them all about the rules and regulations and all the terrible things that Europe was enforcing on them, but never talked about the freedoms and the benefits. And in the UK, politicians have reaped what they sowed in many ways there. So I think we need to continue to do that. But the third, and I'm conscious that this weekend we remember this. This weekend we'll mark the centenary of the end of the First World War, of the armistice, the extent to which Europe was a peace project, that integrating our societies and economies happened as an alternative to war and conflict. And for the younger generation of politicians, particularly my generation, we need to make sure that's not forgotten, because it isn't in our folk memory. It isn't in our memory the way it would have been for Schuman or for Kohl or even for Schroeder, for example, whose father died in the Second World War. We're from this new generation of people who were born European, who were born after our countries joined the EU, who have no memory or recollection of the war and what the alternative to integration is. And I think we need to be the ones to make sure that our people understand that.
Dear Taoiseach, thank you so much for EPP Talk. Thank you for being here. I want to wish you a very successful Congress here in Helsinki.